Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 4, Halacha 2 in the Art Scroll. This is 38A1. This is part 1 of the shiur. Today we're getting into Erevin, Sukkah, and also Kilayim. Yes, the three of these are very, very connected. Why? Because we're dealing with partitions. We were dealing in Chapter 4, Halacha 1 about what is going to be a vineyard and also a wall, and what can you plant if you're going to do another species on the other side of the wall. Well, what's going to be a partition? What's a valid partition? And this is also going to be for sukkah, right? So what's going to be a wall for a sukkah? Well, what's going to be a wall for making erevs and things like that? So the Mishnah starts off, and again, we're trying to deal with what's going to be a halachic barrier between a vineyard and when you're now going to try to go plant foreign seed on the other side of this barrier. So the Mishnah says this is the law of a partition that consists only of freestanding vertical sticks. In other words, the sticks aren't bound by anything. They're just standing by themselves, stuck into the ground like poles, and they're individual poles. So this is important because a row of sticks that are standing vertically in the ground without being connected to each other still can be a partition, and that's what's so surprising about this. So it says that if there are not 3 tefachim between one stick and the next, which is enough room for a goat to enter, it is classified as a valid partition. Now, this is a halacha l'Moshe l'Sinai called Lavud, and that means that if you have 3 tefachim between solid sticks or between parts of a wall, and there's a gap 3 tefachim wide between those solid parts, it's going to count as a solid mass. It's going to deem to be connected like this gap is filled up. So if you have a row of sticks and they're all going to be spaced less than 3 tefachim from one another, it counts as getting sealed up. And one can plant a vineyard on one side of the row and foreign seed on the other side without having to distance seed 4 amos from the vineyard. So that's a big chiddush. Now, if you have a wall that's mostly solid, one is allowed to plant not only next to the solid parts of the wall, but also these gaps. Why? Because these gaps with lavud are considered to be sealed. So the gaps do not break the wall's continuity because it is deemed to be a single mass. And now what happens if you're going to have entranceways? So the Gemara says, or the Mishnah says, this is the law of a fence that was breached. And it says if the gap is up to 10 amos wide, it is regarded as an entranceway, and one may plant even opposite the gap. So gaps that are going to be less than 3 tefachim are going to be considered to be sealed, and any gaps narrower than 3 tefachim are basically having the halachic equivalence of being like a solid wall. It's completely closed. But what about entranceways? Entranceways do not disrupt the continuity of a wall because they are essential to the wall's proper functioning. In other words, if you have something on one side of the fence, something on the other side of the fence, you want to go work on the other side of the fence, you need a doorway, you need an entranceway. It's a proper part of a fence to function. It doesn't just seal things in and then you can't get to the other side if you're doing a work area and it's your own farm. So entranceways are going to be okay, but the law is up to 10 amos wide will be considered to be an entranceway. And the Mishnah says if the gap is greater than that, it's not deemed to be an entranceway and is forbidden to plant opposite the gap. So if the gap of the wall is wider than 10 amos, it cannot be perceived as being an entranceway. It's just a broken part of a wall, and they can function as partitions in their own right for an entrance, and planting opposite the solid parts is going to be permitted without any distancing. And in this ruling, says the Rosh of the Mishnah, and the ruling that's going to be following, the only issue is whether the gaps are considered part of the wall. And if there's no question that the solid sections, at least 4 tefachim wide, are going to be effective barriers, so we're dealing with spacing that's going to be at least 3 tefachim and 10 amos. And basically what we're going to get into is we're going to get into 3 cases. The first part of this shiur is going to get into 3 cases about a wall and gaps in the wall and what you can plant as a foreign species opposite the vineyard on the other side of this wall. So there is a related law, and it says this is the law where there are many breaches made in the fence, and if the total width of all the fence standing sections exceeds the total width of the breaches, planting is permitted alongside the entire fence, even opposite the breaches. But if the total width of all the breaches exceeds the total width of the standing sections, planting opposite the breaches is forbidden. So again, there's going to be really 3 cases, all right? So if you have gaps in the breached section, and they're going to be narrower than 3 tefachim, then the partition is viewed as it's totally solid. And you can plant even alongside these gaps, okay? Now, the next part is going to be, if the gaps are at least 3 tefachim wide, one may not plant next to them unless the partition's solid parts are collectively wider than its gaps. And planting is always permitted opposite a solid divider that's at least 4 tefachim wide. And another part is that if a gap is at least 10 amos wide or more, planting is not permitted opposite under any circumstances. Why? Because it's considered to be a breached wall. And if you're having it where it's 10 amos, it can be perceived as an entranceway. But if you're having it where it's going to be greater than that, it's going to be like a broken wall. So the Gemara says that if someone made boards that stand opposite the spaces in between the rows of the vines in a vineyard, but not opposite the vines themselves. So what is this saying? This is saying, says the Mara Fulda, that such a partition is of less halachic significance than the one with at least some solid segments opposite the vines, since the prohibition of Kilayim is going to come from the vines, not coming from the spaces of the vineyard where the work is done. And so it's really more important for a barrier to block the vines than to block the spaces. But nevertheless, even though all the solid segments of the partitions are opposite the spaces, they still carry some halachic weight. That's what the Bryce is trying to say. So the Gemara says, and each standing section of the Brisa has a width of at least 4 tefachim wide. So in other words, you have boards that somebody stuck into the ground. And each board is going to be 4 tefachim wide. Okay? And the Gemara says the total width of all the standing sections exceeds the total width of the breaches. And the Gemara says planting foreign seed opposite the standing sections is permitted, but planting foreign seed opposite the breaches is forbidden. In other words, you've stuck these boards in the wall, and it's to make a wall. And basically what it's saying is, look, where you have these boards that are 4 tefachim wide, again, a tefach is a handbreadth, you can plant right alongside the 4 tefach board. But in this kind of case, you can't plant in the gaps, right? So you can plant behind the board, but not behind the gaps. Usually, if a wall is going to be having standing segments, and they're going to be collectively wider than the breaches, then it's perceived as a single continuous partition, and you can plant forbidden seed there, even next to the breach, provided that one of the breaches does not exceed 10 amos. Why? Because that would be an entranceway. But in this case, what it's trying to do is it's trying to give a halachically weaker wall because all the boards are positioned opposite spaces between vines. And then you have a problem where it's not a single partition and a single gap. It's a series of gaps and it's a series of partitions. So planting in this kind of way in the gaps is going to be a problem. but planting next to the boards is no problem. So it's counted like each board is like a mini fence. That's really what it's trying to say. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to deal with a new case, but it's going to be in reverse. It's going to be the opposite case. So the Gemara says, if someone made a partition of boards that stand only opposite the vines and not the spaces between the vines, and each standing section does not have a width of 4 tefachim, and the total width of all the breaches exceeds the total width of the standing sections, then planting foreign seed opposite the standing sections is permitted, but planting foreign seed opposite the breaches is forbidden. Again, each board is going to be narrower than 4 tefachim. In the last case, each board was 4 tefachim. In this case, each board is less than 4 tefachim. So what this is trying to say is if most of the wall is breached, then the remaining solid sections do not combine to make a partition. Rather, each is just going to be an independent divider. And as a rule, you can't plant next to a divider of any kind unless it's going to be at least 4 tefachim wide. So again, what's going to be like a mini divider has to be at least 4 tefachim. And in this case, where the standing sections are going to be especially significant because all of them block only the vines and not the spaces between the vines, they're effectively even narrower than 4 tefachim. So let's talk about the case in the Mishnah, the case in the Bryce's first case, and this case, and I'll explain it. So in the Mishnah, it talks about a standard partition which blocks both the vines and the spaces between the vines, and if the standing segments constitute the majority of the partition, one may plant even next to a gap. Why? You could do that as long as it's not going to be a gap of 10 amos, but if the gaps constitute a majority, then each standing section is deemed to be isolated, and planting foreign seed there is going to be forbidden next to the gap, but permitted next to a standing section. However, in order for a standing section to be an effective divider, each board has to be at least 4 tefachim wide. Let's look at the next. The Bryce is dealing with partitions that block only the spaces between the vines, and the law is going to be more stringent because the standing sections are isolated even if they are collectively wider than the breaches in the hole, the breaches in the fence. So planting foreign seed is never permitted except opposite the standing section, and it has to be at least 4 tefachim wide. And in the last case that we just covered, the Bryce's second part of the clause is referring to a partition that blocks only the vines themselves, and in this case, the law is going to be more lenient, and if the standing sections are isolated because the breaches are collectively wider than the standing sections, then each is going to be an effective barrier, even if it's going to be narrower than 4 tefachim. So now we're going to get into something that's very, very familiar for those looking at the second sukkah, and it's going to look at another kind of partition called Asuras HaPesach. Now, Asuras HaPesach is literally just a form of entrance, and it's a minimal boundary. It's a minimal thing that consists of 2 vertical poles connected at the top by a crossbar. That's going to be a string. And since it has a shape of a doorway, it's going to be deemed to be a valid partition. And that's going to be the case with the actual doorway. And therefore, if a vineyard is bordered on each side with just a Asuras HaPesach, it's going to be fully enclosed as if it were surrounded by solid walls. Now, Asuras HaPesach is more effective than just a gap in the wall, which lacks a crossbar. And the latter is going to be effective as it does not break continuity of the wall that has breaches. So, Asuras HaPesach, by contrast, is a valid partition even when it's standing by itself and not adjoined with other wall segments. And this comes up with Masechet Sukkah and Eruvin. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says in the name of Rabbi Yudah ben Hanina that if one thrust 4 poles in the ground at 4 corners of a vineyard, and he tied a reed across the top of the poles, it saves the adjacent land from being subject to the prohibition of Kilayim because it is a Asuras HaPesach braid. This, by the way, is the crossbar that's going to be at the top, and it's surprising. And it says, basically what it's trying to say, and by the way, there's going to be an opposing opinion coming up, but basically what it's trying to say is that each pair of adjacent poles and the reed across it is going to form a legally valid partition, and that's going to allow you to plant foreign seed next to a vineyard. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's leniency is applying even where the poles in the corners of the vineyard are going to be more than 10 amos apart, and this Asuras HaPesach is going to be wider than 10 amos. That's going to be invalid with respect to Shabbos, but Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish over here is going to be saying it's fine for Kilayim. That is a big Hiddush. Now, Rabbi Yonah disagrees with that, and he says, as it is a partition for Shabbat, so is it a partition for Kilayim. In other words, only a partition fit for Shabbos is going to be also fit for Kilayim. In other words, this is not going to be more lenient than for Shabbat. And the Gemara is going to give support for Rabbi Yochanan's position, where it says, Rabbi Yochanan said that a brisa teaches that it once happened that Rabbi Yeshua ben Korchach went to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in Nag Ninar, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Korchach pointed out a field to him and says that this was called Bet Havirta, and its wall there were breaches more than 10 amos wide. And so Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri would take pieces of wood and seal the breaches, and tapered the poles and seal the breaches until he reduced them to less than 3 amos wide. In other words, he's putting stakes in the ground so that he's sealing up these gaps where you have breaches that are more than 10 amos to make it so that there would be a breach that would just be 10 amos. And now between each of these sticks, like what we saw in the Mishnah, you can, it's going to be sealed up with Lavud. And because each, empty part is only going to be 3 tefachim or less. So the Gemara says that he reduced them to less than 10 amos. And he said a partition like this is also a valid partition for Shabbat. In other words, this is a Tana saying this, and the Tana is saying that not only is this going to be good for Kilayim, it's also going to be for Shabbat. And basically what this is saying is a partition that's valid for Shabbos is also valid for Kilayim, vice versa. You have to, have a partition that's going to be for both. And it's not going to be like what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is implying that, it can be good for Kilayim, but not necessarily for Shabbat. Now, the Gemara is going to be teaching that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish agrees with Rabbi Yonah regarding Shabbos. That actually is going to be a Chiddush. And Rabbi Zera says that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish agrees that with respect to Shabbos, a Asuras HaPesach braid more than 10 amos long does not save from the Shabbos prohibition. In other words, it's going to fail to render the enclosed area in where people can transport items on Shabbat. And basically, the Gemara now is going to try to prove that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish actually does agree that such a big thing is not going to be fit for Shabbos. His only point is going to be that that's fine that it's not fit for Shabbos, but it's okay for Kilayim. That's his point. So Rabbi Haggai says, in effect, a Mishnah says that if travelers who encamp for Shabbos want to enclose their campsite, so they're allowed to carry there on Shabbos, they can surround it with 3 horizontal ropes, one above the other, and their partition will form an enclosed area, and you're allowed to carry within it for Shabbat. And basically what it's going to say, the Gemara says, if you'll say that the Asuras HaPesach saves and is effective with regard to Shabbos, then even if it's more than 10 amos wide, why does the Mishnah require 3 ropes? By the way, this is very familiar when you're building your sukkah with the metal poles. You need the 3 ropes. And basically, the Gemara says that 1 rope at the top should just be enough. Why? That would form a Asuras HaPesach. But by requiring the lower ropes as well, the Mishnah is implying that the Asuras HaPesach is invalid in this case, and you need to have it. The problem is it would be wider than 10 amos. So we see that Asuras HaPesach wider than 10 amos is unfit for Shabbos. And having established that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish considers Asuras HaPesach wider than 10 amos valid for Kilayim, but not for Shabbos, the Gemara is going to try to define which type of boundary he's referring to. Rabbi Yonah says that Rabbi Yeshaya asked that this Asuras HaPesach braid, what do you say about it? And the Gemara says, is it on top of the poles or at the side of the poles? In other words, it's going to be like when you're building your sukkah and you have all of the braids on the side. And Rabbi Yeshaya spells out the ramifications for the question. It's going to say, if you say that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish refers to the braid on top of the poles and still disqualifies it for Shabbos because it's going to be wider than 10 amos, then he would certainly disqualify for Shabbat a braid at the side. And why would he be disqualifying that? When the braid is at the top of the poles, the structure bears a greater resemblance to a door frame than, when the braid is going to be at the side, because the crossbar of a door frame is going to rest on the top of the side post. So Rabbi Yeshaya is going to basically be saying that, in fact, the one at the top is going to be halachically more significant. The Gemara says, then, he would certainly disqualify for Shabbat a braid at the side. And if you'll say that he refers to the braid at the side, it follows that he disqualifies for Shabbos only that type of braid, but not on top. Rather, the braid is on top. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish effectively is going to be deeming the Asuras HaPesach, even though wider than 10 amos, where he's going to be saying that it could be valid for Shabbos. So Rabbi Yeshaya is saying that perhaps Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying that it's going to be valid for Shabbos. So that also would be a new piece of information here. There's another ramification about Rabbi Yeshaya's question, and say, if you'll say that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish disqualifies a large Asuras HaPesach, in other words, wider than 10 amos wide for Shabbos use, even if the braid is going to be just on top of the doorpost, then Rabbi Haggai said nothing. In other words, Rabbi Haggai's proof that the Mishnah is quoting dealing with 3-rope partition doesn't mean anything. And Rabbi Haggai is basically arguing that since the Mishnah requires all 3 ropes as opposed to just the upper rope, which would be enough for the Asuras HaPesach, then even Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish must be agreeing that the large Asuras HaPesach is going to be unfit for Shabbos. And if Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is referring to a braid on top of the side posts, then the Mishnah has no bearing on this opinion, because the Mishnah disqualifies this only if the braid is attached to the sides of the doorpost, whereas Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is only referring to the braid on top of the doorposts. So the Gemara is going to defend Rabbi Haggai's proof, and we're going to get into that tomorrow. But anyway, this is all trying to point out what's going to be a valid braid, what is going to be a partition. And according to the Vilna Goan, Rabbi Yeshaya's question is going to be more general. He's going to be saying that if you have a standard Asuras HaPesach that's not more than 10 amos wide, then it should be valid even when the braid is at the side or only at the top. So the Gemara, according to the Vilna Goan, could be trying to resolve this question by citing Rabbi Haggai's argument regarding something larger than 10 amos, but it would look like if it's going to be shorter than 10 amos, then everybody would agree that it's going to be okay for Shabbos. So have a great day, and we'll get more into this tomorrow.